Сьогодні, коли я йшов виступати перед британським парламентом, найстрашнішим числом було для мене 50. 50 вбитих українських дітей за 13 днів війни. А вже за годину стало 52. 52 дитинки. Ніколи не пробачимо це.
For those listening but not viewing, that was President Zelensky giving an update on the casualties in Ukraine. They are specifically focusing on the number of children that have already died, saying that the number has now gone up to 52 with additional deaths in the past few days. And obviously every life lost is a tragedy, child or otherwise. Specific to this, conflict or otherwise, we should always mourn these needless deaths, particularly of civilians. And so that is sort of the backdrop for the updates we're going to be giving you now, including breaking news having to do with the possibility of a failure of this nuclear containment at Chernobyl. Really fast, though, Jordan, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in. Zelensky has been doing these appeals to basically to the world, trying to inspire them to take this more seriously. What do you make of his international media efforts so far? Do you think it's been effective?
Zelensky has certainly captured the world, that is no doubt. One of the more troubling aspects is how people have responded. And it ultimately boils down to how people engage with war and consume war. And I was talking to a friend, Spencer Ackerman, the other night, who spent time covering the Iraq invasion on the ground. And when you see it firsthand, you really get a sense of just how abhorrent war as a global force and like the worst aspects of humanity manifest in wartime. And it's something that sticks with you forever. So to convey that, I think he's doing a good job. But the way people consume it and have turned him into like a sex figure and like just the same type of behavior that they did with like Cuomo. It's like we need to like recognize that even in times of global crisis, like we have to identify the real human suffering that happens in moments like this. And it's because of how heavily propagandized people are about war. They sell this myth of war through video games, movies, TV shows, whatever, and it totally sanitizes it. And you have, like you just pointed out, innocent civilians being killed, and people are just kind of treating him like a daddy, and just like, can we just take a step back and talk about what's happening?
I agree, and that does bother me too. I do think that's not, thankfully, as big of a response. Like there are definitely people doing that. I think you're right to point it out. The effect of all of this that I find more bothersome is like people going out and looking for what's a Russian thing I can get rid of? Who like there was a Russian, I think like a violinist or something that lost a position like that. They play the violin. They don't pilot helicopters. Like you can still eat Russian food in America. The chef didn't invade Ukraine. So let's be clear. If you're old enough to remember what it was like to be an American as we were invading Iraq, probably didn't like the idea that you would be lumped in with George W. Bush. The Trump years, I did not support what Trump was doing. I don't want people to associate me with him in the same way. Some random Russian bakery owner is not necessarily a big backer of Vladimir Putin. So let's bear that in mind. Everything bounds of reason. We have to take seriously what is actually going on, which he does get into. And I want to let people know that there's a lot of developments that are potentially incredibly consequential. One that happened just since our last show is there had been this complicated plan where in theory, the US was gonna transfer F-16s to Poland. In response, Poland was going to transfer MiG-29s into Ukraine, which was already difficult because the F-16s we were gonna give to Poland in this plan were already promised to Taiwan. That has now blown up, by the way, with Poland saying that they're just gonna give us the MiGs and let us figure out how to get them into Ukraine. But of course, that was the whole problem in the first place. I mean, in theory, we could give F-16s, although to be fair, Ukrainian pilots are more familiar with these MiGs. That said, everybody is worried about what could potentially be interpreted as sparking a war. There's some things that seem fairly clear. There's a lot of other things that can be done that are apparently okay. That plan, if it had gone through, I guess wasn't a massive escalation, I suppose. Us transferring in, as we said earlier this week, thousands and thousands of anti-tank weapons. I guess as long as we don't shoot them, it's okay. We're in a very weird world in terms of what could potentially spark a full-on fight with Russia, Jordan.
Right, and there's a couple different elements here. So to go back to your first question, like Zelensky's emotional appeals are what's being used to justify some of these increased escalations and acts of aggression, right? Like if something were to happen to him, God forbid, or if Kyiv falls, that's going to be used as a springboard to justify either a no-fly zone or an increased military engagement from NATO allies and Western states, right? That's terrible, and that's why we need to kind of like compartmentalize his address and the way he's speaking to the media and actual consequences of something like a no-fly zone. And there's Philip Breedlove, who is a retired 4-star Air Force general, admitted in an NPR interview recently that a no-fly zone is essentially an act of war. His words, because it requires you to, protect a zone. I don't think a lot of people understand what it is specifically. And that even means bombing into enemy territory if there are, trucks or munitions or whatever attacking the planes that are enforcing a no-fly zone outside of it. So what you would essentially be doing is guaranteeing bombing of Russian land, which is only going to trigger a greater conflict. And that is horrific. And while it seems noble to support this in the United States, what people don't really realize and think about critically is that's not a war fought here. That is a war that's primarily going to be fought in Ukraine. And we're not going to feel the direct and devastating impacts. They will. So it's very easy for people here to say, oh, let's do it. And there's a ton of support, but it's going to make their lives even worse.
Yeah. Well, look, heads up to the director. We're gonna jump around a little bit because we're talking now about the no-fly zone. So let's jump ahead to the Manchin thing. There are not just regular people, although we'll get to them, who are continuing to push for this. Now, notably, Zelensky is pushing for a no-fly zone. Other members of Ukrainian parliament have been going on US media to push for it. Joe Manchin is actually trying to pressure Joe Biden to keep it as something potentially that we could do, a no-fly zone. And here is the issue. A lot of people, as Jordan alluded to, don't necessarily understand what that means. I don't know if they think it's like stern words or something. Here's the most horrifying thing, perhaps, that we will talk about on the show today. Jacques Henrich had this tweet 2 days ago. Some members of Congress are beginning to advocate for a non-kinetic no-fly zone, something to the effect of using electromagnetic pulse, sonar, and cyber to keep Russian jets on the ground so they can never take off. Unclear how much support this will end up getting, particularly when almost none of that is a thing. I don't know if somebody watched Battlestar Galactica recently and got some crazy ideas out of it. Theoretically, some sort of cyber attack maybe could hinder their bases. That would definitely be seen as an attack on Russia. There is no electromagnetic pulse outside of like literally GoldenEye era detonating a nuclear weapon in the high atmosphere to produce an electromagnetic pulse that would admittedly ground Russian jets and to destroy every electronic in a wide swath of Ukraine. There are people in Congress who are talking about absolute sci-fi madness, Jordan. And the issue is that many of their constituents already support this sort of thing. There was a poll, 74% of Americans said that we should have a no-fly zone. Now, I question how many of them have any idea what it is, but they might soon be being told about electromagnetic pulses and sonars and all that. Now, when you explain it, there's evidence that people don't necessarily support what would in the end literally be brinksmanship with Russia over the possible shooting down of their planes. In Britain, they actually explained in a poll what it would require, the actual shooting down of jets. And 39% to 28% said they don't support it over supporting it. So there's a big job on us. The country can have a debate about whether they want to have this, but if they're going to have that debate, Jordan, we should at least be clear about what it is and what technology actually exists.
Right, and that's never the case with the media in talking about war. They love to sell it because it boosts ratings, it makes them feel important and like their job has increased importance and severity. But once you explain what this entails, then all of a sudden you see this drastic reduce in support.
Yeah.
But Americans are, subject to intense military propaganda. We like to police the world, and it's aided by Zelensky's emotional pleas for one. And I like, you kind of understand where he's coming from, because obviously he doesn't want to see his people killed, but that is, not, unfortunately, it's just not the best approach. And think about this too, right? How its effectiveness. What you would do is just draw invisible lines and say, no, you can't fly here. You're going to do that to the guy who just crossed an invisible line, a border with troops to invade another country, and you're going to act like you think he's going to respect
Jordan,
this?
But was he told not to invade? Maybe it's about the warning.
It's so ludicrous.
It's, again, people can have a difference of opinion on this and they can advocate for their position. I would ask, I think we should be able to demand, honestly, that, like Jordan is saying, we know what it is that we're discussing. That's all. Anyway,
the guy who's like killing innocent civilians, like this is something that would violate the Geneva Convention. It constitutes a war crime. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's nothing that can really stop him from doing it, but he doesn't care. So why would he respect a no-fly zone?
Exactly. Look, maybe some people think that a war with Russia would not necessarily be the worst thing. I think that they have less influence over the media than in past conflicts. Thankfully, people are a little bit more worried about Russia than they are about, Iraq, Afghanistan, those sorts of things. But we do still have to be on guard for this. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.